He thought the past was buried forever, until his son opened one box he was never supposed to find. For 6 years, he told his son a story that was never true. Today, the truth finally caught up to him. "Dad, where is Mom?" A simple question. An impossible answer. 6 years of silence. One ring. And a secret that was never what it seemed. He spent 6 years running from the truth. Now, he's finally ready to find it.
If you have ever held on to a promise even after everyone told you to let it go, this story is for you. A little boy found a ring hidden inside an old shoebox, and the question he asked next would tear open a secret his father had buried for 6 long years. Before we go any further, if stories about family, truth, and second chances move you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to hear is the kind of story that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. Now, let's begin. David Carter was 38 years old when his whole world folded into a single cardboard box. He lived in a small 2-bedroom house on the edge of Maple Hollow, a quiet town where everyone knew everyone, and where 6 years earlier, everyone had also known his wife, Sarah. David was a carpenter by trade, a broad-shouldered man with tired hazel eyes, a short beard streaked with early gray, and hands that were rough from years of sanding wood and fixing other people's homes while his own life slowly came apart. He raised his son, Ethan, alone. Ethan was 8 now, a bright, curious boy with unruly brown curls and his mother's soft brown eyes. The kind of eyes that made David's chest ache every time his son laughed too loudly or tilted his head a certain way while thinking. It was a Sunday afternoon, one of those lazy autumn days when the light through the windows turns everything gold, and David had finally decided to clean out the attic. He had been putting it off for years, partly because he never had the time, and partly because he knew exactly what was up there. Boxes of Sarah's things, old photographs, a wedding dress still wrapped in plastic, things he could not bring himself to throw away, and things he could not bring himself to look at either. Ethan, being Ethan, insisted on helping. He loved the attic. To him, it was not a graveyard of memories, but a treasure chest full of dusty mysteries and forgotten toys. While David sorted through old tax papers and broken picture frames, Ethan dug through a smaller box tucked behind a rolled-up rug. Inside, wrapped in a faded blue handkerchief, he found a small ring box. He opened it, and there it was, a simple gold band, scratched but shining faintly in the dusty light. "Dad," Ethan said, holding it up between 2 small fingers. "Whose ring is this?" David turned, and the moment he saw the ring, something in his chest tightened like a fist closing around his heart. It was his wedding ring. Not the one he wore, the one he had lost years ago in what he always told people was an accident at a construction site. He had lied about that, the way he had lied about so many small things to protect his son from the truth. He walked over slowly and took the ring from Ethan's hand, turning it over in his fingers. "It's mine," he said quietly. "I thought I lost it a long time ago." Ethan studied his father's face the way children do when they sense something is being hidden from them, some emotion too large for a simple answer. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked the question that had been sitting unspoken between them for 6 years, the question David had dreaded since the day his son had learned to speak in full sentences. "Dad, where is Mom?" The attic went silent except for the faint creak of the old wooden beams settling in the afternoon heat. David sat down on an overturned crate, the ring still warm in his palm, and for the first time in 6 years, he did not know how to lie anymore. To understand what happened to Sarah Carter, you have to go back nearly 10 years, to the spring when David first met her at a small diner off Route 9, where she worked weekends while finishing her degree in early childhood education. She had a laugh that made strangers turn their heads, a stubborn kindness that refused to let anyone around her feel invisible, and an unshakable belief that people were fundamentally good, even when they gave her every reason to doubt it. David was quiet and guarded, having grown up with a father who left when he was young and a mother who worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Sarah was the first person who made him believe that a home could be built on more than just survival. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony behind her parents' farmhouse. String lights hung between the trees, homemade pie instead of wedding cake, and vows that David had written and rewritten a dozen times because he wanted to get every word right. He remembered slipping the gold band onto her finger and thinking that for the first time in his life, he had something worth protecting. A year after the wedding, David partnered with his childhood friend Richard Voss to start a small construction and renovation business. Richard was charismatic, quick with numbers, and endlessly persuasive, the kind of man who could sell warmth to the sun. David handled the labor and the craftsmanship, Richard handled the books and the clients, and for the first few years, Carter and Voss Construction thrived. Ethan was born during their third year in business, and David remembered holding his son for the first time and feeling, for once in his life, that everything had finally clicked into place. But prosperity has a way of exposing the cracks in a person's character, and Richard's cracks ran deeper than anyone knew. Behind the scenes, Richard had begun making risky investments with company funds, chasing quick returns to cover mounting personal debts from a gambling habit he kept hidden from everyone, including his own wife. When two of those investments collapsed, Richard was left owing money to people who did not send polite letters when payments were late. Rather than confess to David, Richard began quietly siphoning money from client deposits, falsifying invoices, and covering the gaps with new client funds in a cycle that could only spiral downward. David, trusting his old friend completely, signed whatever paperwork Richard placed in front of him without a second glance, a mistake that would soon cost him almost everything. The unraveling began on a rainy Thursday in October, 6 years before the day Ethan found the ring. A client, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Whitfield, called David directly, furious that the renovation on her home had stopped without explanation despite her having paid the full deposit months earlier. David checked the books that night for the first time in months, and what he found made his stomach drop. Accounts that should have held tens of thousands of dollars were nearly empty. Invoices had been altered. Client funds had been moved and reused to plug earlier holes, a financial house of cards that was now collapsing floor by floor. David confronted Richard that same night in the office above their workshop, and for the first time in 15 years of friendship, he saw something cold and desperate behind Richard's eyes. Richard did not deny it. Instead, he begged. He explained the gambling debts, the men he owed money to, men who had already started making threats against his family. He told David that if the fraud came to light now, it would not just end the business, it would draw the attention of the very people Richard owed money to, and those people did not care whose name was on the paperwork. Richard warned, with a kind of desperate, twisted logic, that if David went to the police immediately, it could put both of their families in danger before any arrests were even made. David, torn between loyalty, fear for his own family, and a sense of justice, told Richard he needed time to think, time to figure out how to protect Sarah and Ethan while still doing the right thing. He never got that time. 3 days later, Sarah vanished. David came home from the workshop to find the house eerily quiet, Sarah's car gone, and a note on the kitchen counter written in handwriting that looked like hers but felt wrong somehow. Too rushed, too final. The note said she needed time away, that she had met someone else, that she was sorry, and that she hoped David would move on and take care of Ethan. David read it a dozen times that night, unable to reconcile the woman he knew. The woman who had once driven 2 hours in a snowstorm just to bring him soup when he was sick with the woman who had apparently abandoned her family without so much as a phone call. He searched for her, of course. He hired a private investigator he could barely afford, filed a missing persons report that police treated as a simple case of a wife leaving her marriage, and reached out to every friend and family member Sarah had ever mentioned. But the trail went cold within weeks. Sarah's parents, devastated and confused, eventually stopped returning David's calls, unsure of what to believe, and unwilling to relive the pain of a daughter who seemed to have simply walked away. The town, small and quick to gossip, settled comfortably into the story of the wife who had run off with another man, leaving David to raise their son alone. David never fully believed it, not in his heart, but with no evidence and no leads. Belief did not pay the bills or put his son to bed at night. Richard, meanwhile, used Sarah's disappearance as cover for his own crimes. In the chaos and grief that followed, Richard quietly settled with the debt collectors using stolen funds, dissolved the partnership by insisting David was too distracted by his personal life to run the business, and walked away with what remained of Carter and Voss Construction's assets, leaving David with debt, a broken heart, and a son who cried himself to sleep asking when mommy was coming home. David was too consumed by grief and survival to notice the timing, too broken to question why his oldest friend suddenly seemed eager to close the business and move to another town within a year of Sarah's disappearance. For 6 years, David rebuilt his life brick by brick, the same way he rebuilt other people's homes. He took odd carpentry jobs, worked nights when Ethan was asleep, and slowly paid off the debts Richard's fraud had left behind, never telling his son the full truth, because how do you explain betrayal and fraud to a child who only understands that his mother is gone? He told Ethan that mommy had to go away, that it was not his fault, that being loved by two parents who could not live in the same house did not mean being loved any less. It was a fragile, incomplete truth, one David hated telling but could not yet replace with anything better, because he himself did not know the real story. He dated no one. He trusted almost no one. The bitterness he carried was quiet but constant, a low hum beneath every interaction, every missed anniversary, every school event where other kids had two parents cheering from the bleachers while Ethan only had David, waving hard enough for two. There were moments over those 6 years that tested David in ways he never expected. He remembered Ethan's first day of kindergarten, standing at the classroom door watching other mothers straighten collars and snap photographs, while he awkwardly tried to do both jobs at once, tears he refused to let his son see burning behind his eyes. He remembered the school Mother's Day craft project when Ethan, only 5 at the time, had asked his teacher if he could make 2 cards instead, one for his grandmother, because he did not want to be the only child in class with an empty desk beside his artwork. He remembered nights when Ethan would wake from nightmares asking if David was going to disappear too, and David would sit on the edge of his son's bed until sunrise some nights, promising over and over that he was not going anywhere, a promise he intended to keep even if it meant working himself to exhaustion to prove it. Each of these moments had hardened something in David, not into cruelty, but into a quiet, controlled resolve that one day, somehow, his son would not have to grow up wondering why his mother left without a word. And now, 6 years later, sitting on an overturned crate in a dusty attic with his son's question hanging in the air, David finally understood that he could not keep feeding Ethan half-truths forever. He looked at the ring in his palm, then at his son's patient, waiting eyes, and he made a decision that had been 6 years in the making. "Ethan," he said slowly, "I don't fully know where your mom is, but I think it's time I found out the truth, real truth, not the story people told me." That night, after Ethan was asleep, David sat at the kitchen table with the ring, the old missing persons file the private investigator had given him years ago, and a box of Sarah's belongings he had never had the courage to fully go through. Near the bottom of the box, tucked inside a paperback novel Sarah used to read, he found something he had never noticed before, a folded piece of paper with a phone number and the initials R5th written in Sarah's handwriting, dated just 4 days before she disappeared. Richard Voss. David's hands went cold. He had not spoken to Richard in nearly 5 years, not since Richard sold his share of the remaining business assets and moved 3 states away to start over, supposedly with the small amount of money left after the partnership dissolved due to unforeseen circumstances. David had accepted that story because he had no energy left to question it. But now, staring at his wife's handwriting linked directly to the man who had once begged him to stay quiet about fraud just days before Sarah vanished, the old grief curdled into something sharper. Suspicion. And beneath the suspicion, a slow-burning anger he had suppressed for 6 years finally began to rise to the surface. Over the following weeks, David became a man possessed by a single purpose. He hired a new investigator, a sharper one this time, a retired detective named Marcus Boone who specialized in cold cases and financial fraud. Marcus reopened threads no one had bothered to pull before. He traced the phone number to a prepaid burner phone purchased the same week Sarah disappeared, a phone that had made 3 calls, all to a number registered under an alias Richard had used before, an alias tied to a shell account where thousands of dollars from the old construction business had quietly landed years earlier. Marcus also tracked down Mrs. Whitfield, the retired schoolteacher whose complaint had first exposed the fraud years ago. She remembered something the police report had never captured. In the days before Sarah disappeared, she had seen a woman matching Sarah's description, arguing with a man in a parked car outside the old Carter and Voss office. A man Mrs. Whitfield later identified from an old company photo as Richard Voss. She had assumed it was a business dispute at the time and thought nothing more of it, especially once the story spread that Sarah had run off with another man entirely. Piece by piece, a different picture began to emerge, one far darker than the story David had been forced to accept. Marcus theorized, based on the burner phone, the alias, and the witnessed argument, that Richard had approached Sarah directly before David could go to the police, likely threatening that if David reported the fraud, the dangerous men Richard owed money to would come after David's family to send a message. Sarah, terrified for Ethan's safety and unable to reach David before he could act, may have been manipulated or coerced into disappearing, either believing it would protect her family from immediate danger or being outright threatened into silence and hiding, with Richard later staging the note and the story of an affair to permanently redirect suspicion away from himself and toward a fabricated marital collapse. It was a theory that made a terrible kind of sense, and it lit something in David that 6 years of grief had only smothered, not extinguished. This was no longer only about finding Sarah. This was about a man who had used David's trust, his family's pain, and his son's confusion as a shield to protect his own crimes. A man who had let a little boy grow up believing his mother simply stopped loving him. David wanted the truth. And beneath that want, quietly but unmistakably, he wanted Richard to answer for what he had done. Marcus eventually traced Richard to a mid-sized city 4 states away, where he now ran a boutique real estate firm under a slightly altered version of his name, living comfortably, remarried, seemingly untouched by the wreckage he had left behind. David wrestled for days with what to do with this information. Every instinct told him to drive there immediately and confront Richard with his bare hands, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he had caused. But David thought of Ethan, asleep down the hall, still believing half-truths about his mother, and he understood that rage without a plan would only leave his son fatherless too if things went wrong, or leave the truth buried even deeper if Richard simply lawyered up and disappeared again. Instead, David and Marcus built a case. They compiled the financial records, the burner phone trail, Mrs. Whitfield's statement, and Sarah's handwritten note, and brought everything to a state financial crimes unit that specialized in reopening cold fraud cases, a unit Marcus had contacts within from his years on the force. It took another 2 months of interviews, subpoenaed bank records, and careful cross-referencing before investigators felt they had enough to act. During this waiting period, David told Ethan a gentler version of the truth, that he was trying to find out what really happened to Mommy, that it was not as simple as the story he had first been told, and that no matter what he discovered, none of it was Ethan's fault, and none of it meant his mother had stopped loving him. The day investigators moved on, Richard Voss began not with dramatic sirens but with a quiet knock on the door of his new office, financial crimes detectives armed with a warrant built on years of buried evidence. Under pressure, faced with records he could no longer explain away, Richard's careful new life began to crumble the same way David's old life once had. In the hours of questioning that followed, desperate to minimize his own sentence, Richard finally admitted the truth. He had panicked 6 years ago, terrified both of the men he owed money to and of David turning him in. He had contacted Sarah directly, telling her a partial truth wrapped in manipulation, that dangerous men were coming for the family because of what David had almost discovered, that the only way to protect Ethan was for her to disappear quietly and let Richard handle it, and that David could never know the real reason without risking everyone's safety. Terrified and isolated, believing she was protecting her son by leaving without explanation, Sarah had gone into hiding under a different name in a small coastal town, communicating with no one from her old life, checking local newspapers for years for any sign that it was safe to come home, never knowing that the danger Richard described was largely exaggerated to control her, and never knowing that David had spent 6 years believing she left him for someone else. Marcus later told David that finding Sarah had not been easy even with Richard's confession in hand, because she had built her hidden life carefully, working under a different first name at a small bakery, renting a modest apartment under a distant cousin's identity, and avoiding anything that might connect her back to Maple Hollow, including social media, old friends, and even doctors who might have recognized her name from the missing persons alerts that had circulated years earlier. It took investigators nearly 3 weeks of quiet surveillance and careful confirmation before they were certain the woman working the early shift at a coastal bakery was truly Sarah Carter, and even then, approaching her required care, because after 6 years of living in fear, she did not immediately trust the detectives who first knocked on her apartment door. It was only when Marcus showed her a recent photograph of Ethan, sent by David the week before, that Sarah finally broke down, realizing after all this time that the danger she had run from believing it would protect her son had instead cost her 6 years of his childhood she could never fully get back. David received the call from Marcus on a Tuesday evening while helping Ethan with his math homework at the kitchen table. When Marcus said the words, "We found her, David. She's alive. She's safe," David had to sit down on the floor right there in the kitchen, unable to speak, unable to fully process 6 years of grief cracking open into something he had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The reunion happened 2 weeks later, in the same small kitchen where David had once read a goodbye note he never truly believed. Sarah stood in the doorway, older, thinner, her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent years looking over her shoulder, but unmistakably, achingly herself. Ethan, who had been told only that a special visitor was coming, stood frozen for a long moment, staring at a woman he barely remembered from photographs, until something in his small heart recognized something deeper than memory. He crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps and wrapped his arms around her waist, and Sarah sank to her knees on the kitchen floor, holding her son for the first time in 6 years, sobbing the kind of sobs that carry the weight of everything unsaid for far too long. David stood back, watching the gold ring still in his pocket, where he had carried it every day since Ethan found it in the attic. When Sarah finally looked up at him over their son's shoulder, there were no words either of them could find that felt big enough for 6 stolen years, so David simply knelt down beside them both and wrapped his arms around his family, all 3 of them together on the kitchen floor. And for the first time since that rainy October 6 years ago, David Carter felt whole again. Richard Voss was later convicted on multiple counts of financial fraud, witness tampering, and coercion, receiving a sentence that finally held him accountable not just for the money he stole, but for the 6 years of stolen family time he had engineered to protect himself. David chose not to pursue a physical confrontation, understanding by then that real justice was not something he needed to deliver with his own hands. It was something the truth itself, patiently uncovered, had already delivered far more completely than any act of revenge could have. In the months that followed, David and Sarah did not simply pick up where they left off, because 6 years changes people, and healing a family takes more than a single reunion in a kitchen. They went to counseling together, slowly rebuilding trust one honest conversation at a time, learning how to talk about the years they had lost without letting bitterness settle back into rooms that were finally starting to feel like home again. Ethan, for his part, asked question after question, the way children do when they are finally allowed to understand the world around them, and David and Sarah answered every single one with as much honesty as an 8-year-old heart could hold. There were hard days, too, moments when old wounds resurfaced unexpectedly, a missed school play Sarah could never get back, a birthday she had not been there to celebrate, a version of Ethan's childhood she had only heard about secondhand. David found himself more than once having to forgive not Sarah, but the 6 years themselves, the unfairness of time that could never truly be returned. Sarah moved back into the house gradually, first as a frequent visitor, then, nearly a year later, as a permanent part of the family again, this time built not on secrets and silence, but on a hard-won understanding that love without the whole truth is only half a foundation. Slowly, the house on the edge of Maple Hollow began to feel less like a place David had survived in, and more like a place his family was finally, truly living in together. Years later, David would keep that same gold ring in a small wooden box he built himself, a box that sat on the mantel where Ethan could see it every day, not as a reminder of what was lost, but as a reminder of what was found. When people in town asked about those missing years, David no longer offered the old lie about an accident at a construction site or a marriage that simply fell apart. He told them the truth, that sometimes the people we love are taken from us not by their own choices, but by the fear and greed of others, and that sometimes, if you are patient enough and brave enough to keep asking questions, the truth finds its way home, even after 6 long years. Ethan grew up understanding something most children never have to learn so young, that love does not always look like a picture-perfect family, that families can break and still find their way back to each other, and that a father who tells the truth, even when it takes years to find it, is worth more than a lifetime of easy answers. He kept a small drawing on his bedroom wall for years afterward, one he made shortly after his mother came home, of 3 stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a small golden circle drawn carefully above their heads, like a tiny sun watching over all of them, a quiet reminder that even after the longest, hardest years, a family could still find its way back into the light. If this story moved you even a little, remember that the truth is always worth searching for, no matter how long it takes to find, and that the people who truly love us are worth fighting for until the very end. If you believe that too, make sure you are subscribed to this channel because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told, and I promise you, the next one might just find its way straight into your heart the same way this one did.